and I start by introducing our second keynote speaker, João Sebastião from University Institute of Lisbon. So as yesterday, I'm also going to give a little bit of an overview for those of you who do not know João and his work, which will be a minority, I'd imagine. So I'll give a little bit of an overview and then hand over to him to give his keynote. So João is a sociologist, of course. He's associate professor at the Department of Political Science and Public Policies at the University Institute of Lisbon and a researcher at the Center for Research and Studies in Sociology, where he was also director between 2014 and 2010. His main research areas are social inequalities in education, educational policies, and school violence. In convergence with the research in sociology of education, he worked as an expert in the area of school violence for different national and international institutions, such as the Council of Europe, the EU, the OECD, and as a developer and coordinator of the School Safety Observatory of the Portuguese Ministry of Education. At the CAS, so that's the Council for International Education.
Research Center.
Yeah. Is it? João?
It's CIES. It's
CIES is the center, sorry. Yeah. So CIES is the center. He maintains a line of work of applied science on programs about school success and early school leaving, class dimension, literacy, school violence, and municipal educational plans, cooperating with local authorities and schools. And we're delighted to have you here with us this morning for the keynote for today. And if you could also share your screen, then we can all see the slides. So you can see that the title will be Living in a Maelstrom, Will Educational Inclusion Policies Be Able to Survive COVID-19? Oh yeah, and here is the acronym where I made the mistake. Just on the first slide, there's the Centro de Investigação e Estudos de Sociological.
It's
João,
Research Center in, thank you.
Delighted to have you here. I'll hand over to you. We may still have people joining. I'm just having a look. There's 21 panelists. I think we're nearing, sort of getting all the panelists there. Slightly slower today. There's maybe all
the Ellen depression.
all tired from yesterday, or it's the Friday blues. It's usually Monday blues, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's Friday. So, but I think we make a start anyway, and the few people from the panelists that are still missing are hopefully going to join within the next couple of minutes.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and hello everybody. Thank you very, very much for your kind invitement. Hello, Bernadette. We've known for a long time already.
Hello, João. How are you?
Yeah. So thank you for this kind invitement. I will be trying to speak about what I tried to synthesize in the title, if in fact educational inclusion policies will survive COVID-19. Well, policies, as you know, are not persons or individuals. So, but they can suffer as well from this pandemic and this crisis. In this crisis, as sociologists, we know well, it's not only a sanitary crisis, it's a social, economic, and political crisis. So I think there are a lot of to discuss and to analyze around this pandemic, because it only shows some of the difficulties that the educational systems are having today and will be having more, I think, in the future. Well, I took as a departure point the definition of inclusive education, which was on the call. So I'm not going to discuss inclusive education or the concept or all the theoretical discussion of the concept. It was not my intention. But I want to discuss first the idea of crisis. this crisis, this pandemic, this sanitary crisis, it's only the last in a sequence of crises. Everybody under 14 has lived more crises than me. Everybody in the last 10, 15 years has lived as three major crises. Financial crisis, sanitary crisis, different kinds of crises. So living in crisis, it's becoming almost a permanent situation. And this has a lot of consequences because I think we are now seeing well that every time a crisis comes, things are changing, and sometimes we can say exactly that creativity and are exploding with the crisis, is exploding with the crisis. But much worse, I think these several crises, at least from the point where I am, I think these successive crises are underlining the idea that political, civic, and social rights can't be taken at all for granted. Well, economic crisis and financial crisis always put a lot of pressure on social rights, but never used to put a great deal of pressure on political and civic rights. But now I think this particular crisis associated to the 2008, 2010 crisis, what is new is that these crises are putting a strong pressure on political, civic, and also social rights. And there's a structural change on that. Political rights of voting, for example, never were under attack because of a crisis. The idea that some acquired rights, for example, LGBT rights, for example, that were improving, now in lots of countries they are going back. So there are a lot of changes. Women's rights, for example, also in in several countries, are not expanding, are contracting. So I think this sequence of crises underline very well is that political, civic, and social rights as a whole are can't be taken for granted, and that we have to discuss it very well, as we see in several countries. For example, the voting rights are under attack. Well, we need inclusive education are directly linked to all of these rights, not just as a social right, but as a political right and as a civic right. And so if in general, these rights are under attack, so will be inclusive education, because inclusive education deals with handicapped people, deals with migrants, deals with all the minorities in schools, in the educational system. So if rights are under attack, so will be inclusive education. And I will speak about this later. Some of these rights just disappeared in several countries. For example, for disabled children, for example, all the support system for disabled children just disappeared. And the children were sent back to their families without any kind of support. So I think in this sense that we have to expand the debate on inclusive education by taking in greater account the current, but also the future constraints to inclusive education in the production of policies. I could mention, for example, the rising of far-right groups in Europe, but not only in Europe, but in several countries around the world. The impact of this in the institutional arrangements around inclusive education and in the organizational and pedagogical solutions we use and that's the tools we have to deal with this situation. So I think one of the common sense in sociology is that context matters. Well, but I think that context matters much more now than later, because some of what I've said, we are living in crisis as a life condition in several countries. Some countries are surviving better than others to this. We can see the divisions inside the European Union between those more well, some northern countries and some southern countries. The discussions about policies and support in time of crisis. But for the younger generations, mainly for the younger generations, but also for the elderly, living in a crisis is now a life condition. Are having some small periods in between crises. We are just waiting for another crisis. And this has a strong impact in the life conditions, in the possibility of integration and inclusion, in the possibility of funding, for example, social and educational policies. So this is having a strong impact. One other thing that is more or less obvious is that every crisis means the widening of social inequalities. More market deregulation, digitalization, automation, housing crisis, and so on. So the widening of inequalities has strong impact, for example, in this moment of pandemic, when the governments decide, well, everybody's going home and we are going to do homeschooling, well, lots of people around Europe, in the world, didn't have internet conditions, lots of families didn't have. Well, I had students having classes through cell phone, for example. All my African and Brazilian students were having classes through cell phones. The interaction between teacher and professors are very, very small. So, however, these inequalities have a strong impact in the educational policies, particularly in this moment in higher education, with strong pressure to make a huge market. Well, there was already educational market in higher education going, but now it's the perfect moment to digitalize everything and make a world market, or also a digital educational market, as Stefan Ball shows in his work. I think there are another relevant element. It's the impact of political changes, the rise of nationalism, nativism, authoritarianism, and the crisis of multilateralism of the large international organizations. You haven't seen during this crisis United Nations anywhere. the Health World Organization is somewhere in between wars of countries. But nationalism, nativism, and authoritarianism have a long and strong impact in inclusive education. Because as you have seen, this idea, America for the Americans, no migrants in Poland, no migrants in Hungary, and so on, or in Italy, or in every other country, or the persecutions of migrants. And sometimes these migrants don't have to be outside non-European. Sometimes even the European are persecuted by this kind of movement, for example, in England, Germany, and so on. So I think these nationalist and nativist movements will have a strong impact because they don't really want in educational systems the difference. They hate the difference. They hate the LGBT policies. They don't support policies for handicapped children. So I think we have to keep much more attention to these political movements because they will have, they are still having, but they will have much more impact in inclusive education. One other thing that I think it's obvious with this pandemic, there are lots of institutional cracks. For example, mainly the fragility of institutional orders. For example, borders reappeared so soon, they seem they never went away. Borders were closed. Well, the Commission of the European Union is saying, well, try not to close the borders in this second wave, but there are a lot of other examples. The borders are just one example of institutional orders that were impacted. The speed how schools and other institutions were closed, and the idea that democratic rights can be not closed but suspended, at least for a while. So although we think that democracy is strong and will support everything, well, this pandemic shows that the different institutional orders we live in are fragile and only survive if we participate as citizens, if citizenship education is strong, if inclusion education is strong. There are also disruptions in in a different kind of social functions we took for granted. One of them were with handicapped children. All through the world, handicapped children were sent home mostly without support. Imagine families working at home with handicapped children. With disabilities, these families only know slightly, because some kind of disabilities are very specific, and well, families know how to deal with children, but don't know how to do educational programs with children. So indeed, it's a full-time job. you work or you are with your disabled children. So all of these things are a real, I think, setback for inclusive school, because, for example, all the for migrants, for immigration, for example, all the processes were closed. Lots of immigrants, for example, if you think about all of those immigrants in Greece that are nowhere. Well, before this pandemic, we spoke a lot of those refugee camps in Greece and other places. Well, they are nowhere. They can't move because of pandemic, but they can't move because of political. They can't move because of political decisions. Also, for example, in Portugal, some things we had very well, something that it was non-discussable, that even illegal immigrants and children of illegal immigrants could go to an hospital and have treatment for free, and immigrants can go, immigrant children can go to school without questioning their situation in Portugal. Even this situation were questioned. So there are a lot of setbacks in the progress towards a more inclusive education, mainly because of the change, not of the pandemic, but of the political climate around this. So I think we need, in fact, to reshape inclusive education policies. There are, in fact, new political and social challenges. Inclusive education must, I think it's a necessity to have a more political and citizenship education associated, because it's there where it's not in the mostly in the pedagogical or organizational things in this moment, but it's in the political and citizenship rights that inclusive education policies are going to be discussed. Do migrants have rights, and they are setting back? What are you going to do with handicapped children? Because there are a lot of educational systems saying, well, you don't, we are going probably to close schools again. There's no, because of a kind of second wave of coronavirus. So what are we going to do with these children? What are you going to say? The discussion is much more wider than the educational one, but with LGBT and other gender issues in schools, because they are clearly having a setback, are regressing in several countries. Well, so I think we must stress this political and civic education to address the reshape of educational policies towards inclusive education. I think we also have to deal with these institutional cracks. And this is also a political issue. Because we can't send home thousands and thousands of children without the proper social support. So what will we do with all of those children's recent migrants? we have lots of people from Nepal, Nepalese children. We have a lot of Thai children, which just arrived. They don't speak a word of Portuguese. So far away education or internet education is not going to work with them. What are you going to do with this kind of institutional practice? And the third thing it's relevant, it's that we should be discussing more the more digital buzzword. Well, I think Stefan Ball has the huge interest of major computing companies, Dell Foundation and others, about this digital education and the digital classroom and the digital school and the digital everything. But all of these things have a strong impact in curricula. These things have strong impact in children's socialization processes. And in fact, they don't, we can hand with the kind of education for the much more technocratic education, if I can say like that. Having more individualized and individualistic education focused on some technological issues without having a strong public discussion about curricula, about values, about political options in education. So I think we have also to support different pedagogical alternatives, but those pedagogical alternatives that can be widely spread on educational systems. For example, educational communities, as the University of Barcelona, learning communities, as the Ramon Flecha has started a project several years ago, lots of years ago. But this is a kind of alternatives that can be widely spread. I don't like very much those kind of very niche education alternatives that are very good for one school, but we can't reproduce or in another school. Well, that are so specific to a group of schools or a group of teachers. I think we must speak about pedagogical, and we stopped speaking a long time ago about pedagogical alternatives. These learning communities are a very interesting alternative in the sense that they can be widely spread in educational systems, and because it's a reflexive, and they are sociologists and they are putting sociology of education into the work. They are learning communities, puts all the questions at stake: reflective, reflection, citizenship, learning the curriculum itself, and the communication, because it's a dialogic model, the communication processes which integrate the pedagogical processes. So I think we must discuss to end, because I think I've spent all my time. I think we have to discuss much more, not only policy, but also politics around inclusive education at the political wider sense, and at the educational policies also. Well, it's more or less about this. I would like, this is not a bibliography, but I would like to thank Oki Wang and Marcus Ollerer and Tilman Grams for some ideas they gave me for this speech. I think we are all about these questions of the impacts of COVID in educational systems and in societies. We are exploring. We don't have much. We don't have much data. For example, I'm writing a paper about for Spanish with our Spanish for our Spanish colleagues of Sociology Education Journal. I am using data from a media lab we have in our research center, which analyzes all the TV news and newspaper news, but it's the only data. We can't find much data anywhere. So I would like these, at least these three researchers, these three sociologists, for their free thinking, I say. So thank you for listening. Well,
thank you so much, João, for this really interesting talk. Now over to questions, either from the panelists or indeed from those that are following us further afield. Anybody who would like to get us started? Panelists, raise your hands. The attendees, just type your question in the question and answer function box. Anyone? They're all very tired this morning.
it's Friday, August.
Now, Adriana is going to ask a question.
Adriana,
so I
yes,
wait.
Yes, Adriana, please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much.
Good morning.
João, hello, good morning.
Hello.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting and really challenging for you because it's really a current situation that we are living, and it's changing a lot our context at schools and also in a political sense. So thank you very much. It was really interesting. And I really appreciate your point of view of how schools can share their experiences that are successful and that are also taken into account in the research that we do, for example, in sociology of education, and how these can really help to elaborate new politics in education that are really necessary now to take into account these experiences of that are successful. And I think in Portugal you are really leading this kind of politics that are taking into account the practices that are successful. And the information I have in Portugal is that you are really working on, and I'm sure that with the pandemic situation and all that you have explained, you in your country are showing the rest of the countries in Europe, for example, that this is the way that we have to go on. So I really appreciate if you can give, if you have more detail on how in Portugal, from politics, they are doing this change in the educational systems that really have into account what scientific evidence is showing, and we, the researchers, are really working on it. So thank you very much again for your presentation.
Oh, thank you, Adriana.
Yeah.
Well, what's the word? Well, thanks for something. We have in Portugal a government that believes in science, which is not the case everywhere. And we have a government that which relates well with the sociologists. So one of the discussions in Portugal, at the first moment, it was all about psychologists during the pandemic. It was a tsunami of psychologists everywhere speaking about the stress, speaking about how can we deal with each other and so on. But slowly in the media, the sociologists could start to emerge from the wave of psychologists and discussed much more relevant issues, I think. Well, these are relevant issues, but we were discussing other different and relevant things, such as inequalities in face of distance education, for example. The resources the children and families had, the support, what Bourdieu called the cultural capital. It's not, well, everybody knows the concept. I have some, I think the concept that didn't age very well, but it's still the best, the best way to speak about this is about cultural capital. So there started to use discussion about this. How can we support families? So, and there was a huge discussion about this because all families are not in the same situation in distance education, So there was a strong pressure over the government to reduce selectivity in the system, not reducing the way and the need to have good education, but this selectivity which came from behind and from other more neoliberal policies in educational policies in Portugal, much more focused on selection, and that was a good side effect. Less selectivity in the system, and all we know it from different kind of situations in the educational systems that the less selective, in the social sense, selective systems, the more, the better outcomes they have. So that was not, the situation was difficult, but had this good impact. One, in fact, not so good impact was about handicapped children and their families. But they are the usual victims in Portugal. In the last financial crisis, we had a strong neoliberal government associated to the Troika, and they simply made all the teachers, most of the teachers of handicapped children to the unemployment. So they were sent home. We had a neoconservative minister which believed strongly in the idea of natural intelligence. Well, one other relevant discussion in Portugal is in this moment the migrants, the immigrants. Well, we can't have them in this situation. We must have specific programs towards specific target. In the first moment, how they can learn Portuguese as a second language, and how can we promote second language learning among teachers. We have specific training programs for teachers in areas with high density of of immigrants, but now they have to put it in a different way. So most of these, there are other problems because most of these immigrants, well, we don't have the police chasing them on the streets. We never had. It's mostly associated to labor because these immigrants are very much exploited by their bosses. So the authority for work and the borders patrol are always on this because of that situation. And we have an agreement with Spain to follow these Thailandese, these Thai workers and these Nepalese workers. But these children are invisible. And it's not easy in this moment. Well, in school, they are visible. They are there, they can speak. So schools have to promote a special offer for these children. Portuguese classes for children who can't speak a word in Portuguese and so on. But now schools are closed. These children are invisible. And teachers don't, and the social workers don't go anywhere trying to find them. So, because most of them are afraid. Teachers are old in Portugal, in general. They're all over 40 or 45. We have a very aged teacher class. And social workers also don't go. So, these children disappeared from the educational system, and we have to, in fact, to get them back to the educational system. So we have we have some good policies, but some others were not so good as usual. But thank you.